family secrets. They have a way of staying buried until the past forces its way to the surface. I always thought my grandmother loved me until I learned the horrifying truth about what happened when I was a baby. This is the story of how she tried to drown me, and why I'm only now beginning to understand. Based on a true story from Reddit. I'm currently writing this from under a bridge. It's a couple of hours until dawn, and the streets are dead silent. I'm fairly sure I'd hear the sirens when they come for me. I'm hoping that means I have time. I am under no false illusions. I know barely any of you will believe me, and I don't blame you. I'm a scientist, a pragmatist. I've always believed in hard evidence, in the tangible and irrefutable. Ghost stories were for children, and superstitions merely. These same stories persisted into adulthood. So I can imagine what it's like to be you, possibly curled up in a bed somewhere in the dark, scrolling through a strange story written by some distant stranger you have no cause to believe. I've been on your side many a time. But if there's a chance, just a chance, that one of you may have experienced something similar, or have minds malleable enough to accept what I previously thought impossible, then I feel it's important I share my story. For context, I have go as far back as my grandmother, Sylvia. I don't remember much about her. Most of what I know comes from old photographs and whispered conversations I wasn't supposed to hear. Sylvia grew up in a small, middle-of-but-fuck-nowhere Bible town called Driftwood. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, and the church bells regulate daily life more reliably than any clock. Her parents, my great-grandparents, were Old Testament types who saw sin lurking behind every corner, and liked their early morning coffee with the smell of brimstone. They raised Sylvia to fear God with such intensity that she'd spend hours kneeling on the hardwood floor, praying for forgiveness if she so much as took an extra biscuit from the cupboard. There's an old sepia photograph of her I remember Mom kept around for a while, small and dark-featured, with a gaunt little face and lank, unkempt hair. She wore a strange, oversized robe that I later learned was the standard uniform given to the members of the New Eden community. If it's not immediately apparent from the creepy-ass name, yes, it's a cult. You might even remember them by the moniker they later adopted, after all the infamy died out. They were pretty notorious in the 1980s when that Venezuelan singer, Solimar Valencia, joined their ranks. You may know them now as the Brides of Christendom. A questionable rebrand, but it worked. You know the ones. They stand outside Targets and Costco's, wearing those robes that look like bohemian bridal gowns, passing out pamphlets and targeting families with any young girls in tow. And that's now, with all the public scrutiny and police investigations. Imagine how bad it was when they were simply known as the New Eden community. A bunch of nut jobs, sure, but harmless and secular and best left alone. This is the world my grandmother grew up in. Now, I'm not sure what happened exactly, though I've done a fair bit of digging since it started. But my grandmother left New Eden when she was roughly 15. She was taken into a halfway house for underaged and disgraced young mothers where she birthed my mother. As far as I'm aware, Sylvia never told my mother who her father was. He must have been a horrible person, because whenever the question was asked, Sylvia would near about lose her mind. She'd get nasty, violent, would force my mother to kneel on sun-baked gravel for the better part of 8 hours whenever she asked the question. And when my mother would hobble back inside, knees bloody and face salty with dried tears, Sylvia would finish off the punishment with 48 hours of enforced starvation. For Sylvia, the more ribs you could see on a person, the more penitent they were. It's no wonder my mother cut ties as soon as she could. She would tell me that Sylvia would wildly pivot between a loving, delicate woman scarred by New Eden, to a bitter, abusive tormentor, desperate to pass on some of that same trauma to her own daughter. My mother moved states, got a job, and enrolled in night classes. She worked her ass off and ended up in a junior position at a civil law firm. That's where she met my dad, a paralegal. They fell in love, got married, and soon after, Mom got pregnant with me. The pregnancy nearly killed her. It started with seemingly normal symptoms, a persistent low-grade fever that doctors attributed to a mild, chronic infection. She bruised easily, so they pumped her full of vitamins and iron supplements. The tinnitus and heightened sensitivity to smells were written off as typical pregnancy symptoms. But then things started getting weird. My mother developed an overwhelming craving for raw meat. Not just any meat, it had to be fresh, barely touched by refrigeration. My dad would find her in the kitchen at night, standing in the dark, tearing into raw sirloin with her bare hands and teeth. She'd sob afterward, horrified by her own actions, but unable to stop herself. The hunger was all-consuming, primitive. It spooked the hell out of my dad, but he was a first-time father. Pregnancy cravings were a thing, and what the hell did he know? I was strong too strong for a developing fetus. I broke 3 of her ribs as I grew, and the doctors couldn't explain how. But worse than the physical symptoms was the fear. My mother carried around a consuming, endless sense of doom that didn't abate until my birth. She couldn't describe it, couldn't rationalize it, but she was terrified. Not of birth, not of me specifically, but of something else. Something she could sense but not see. It was during her 3rd trimester that she reached out to Sylvia. I think the fear finally overcame her pride, her justified anger at her mother's abuse. No matter their strained relationship, she wanted her mama. And surprisingly, Sylvia came. I found my mother's diary after she passed, and that's how I learned about Sylvia's brief return to our family's life. According to the entries, Sylvia was different, softer, more present. She doted on my mother, cooked for her, helped prepare the nursery. My mother wrote about hope, about the possibility of healing generational wounds through shared experiences of motherhood. Sylvia was respectful, helpful, an anchor during a stressful time. Until she tried to drown me in the bathtub when I was 2 weeks old. My dad found her just in time. He didn't see the knife at first. He was too focused on fishing my tiny body out of the water. Sylvia stabbed him, but the blade caught mostly fabric and just a bit of flesh. She was small, malnourished from years of religious fasting and self-imposed punishment, so my father was able to subdue her while still holding on to me. My mother came running when she heard the commotion, and that's when Sylvia started screaming. The things she screamed haunted my mother, enough that she wrote about them constantly in her journals, etched permanently into ink-stained pages as much as her mind. Sylvia had raved about a curse on the women in our family, about how she hadn't been strong enough to kill my mother when she had the chance, and she wouldn't make that mistake with me. Apparently, she screamed so hard she coughed up blood. She begged my mother to end our line. Said each daughter born was like rolling dice. Not all of us would birth daughters, she said. Some of us would birth something else entirely. They took her away in handcuffs, still screeching about darkness and choosing and something about rooms deep underground where the brides would go. The doctors diagnosed her with religious psychosis, citing her involvement with the New Eden community as the root cause of her break from reality. 3 weeks later, they found her hanging from a bedsheet noose in her room at the psychiatric facility. She left behind a single note for my mother. I tried to save you from being chosen. Now you must save your daughter. End the bloodline before they find her. My parents did their best to give me a normal childhood after that. They never spoke of Sylvia or what happened, though sometimes I'd catch my mother staring at me with this uncertain look in her eyes. But nothing happened. I grew up, went to college, got a degree in biochemistry, and landed a job in pharmaceutical research. I was the very model of rationality and scientific thinking. Then my parents died in a car accident when I was 27. The police said a deer jumped into the road, causing my father to swerve. Their car hit a tree at 60 miles per hour. The officer who called me said they died instantly, but I later read the coroner's report. The impact didn't kill them, the fire did. Witnesses said the car burst into flames before it hit the tree, though the mechanics found nothing wrong with the fuel line or electrical system. I spiraled after their death. Grief does strange things to people, makes them reckless, desperate for connection. That's how I ended up in a bar 3 months after the funeral, drinking whiskey like it was water and going home with a stranger whose face I can barely remember. The pregnancy test came back positive 6 weeks later. The symptoms started immediately, and they were eerily familiar from my mother's diary entries. Like her, I developed an insatiable craving for raw meat. I fought it. Knew it had to be bad for the baby. My mind searches for answers in science. Perhaps I had an iron deficiency and needed a protein boost. Maybe there was a genetic component. I held out for almost 2 months before I gave it, and fuck me, it was the best thing I'd ever tasted. I'd find myself standing in my kitchen at 3 a.m., blood dripping down my chin as I devoured raw chicken hearts I'd bought for the dogs. I loved the sound they made, sinew and muscle giving way beneath my teeth. The fever came next, a constant, low-grade burn that no doctor could explain. My skin would bruise at the slightest touch. But there were new symptoms too, ones my mother hadn't experienced. I started having dreams, horrible, vivid dreams of dark underground rooms where something waited in the shadows. It wasn't a memory, I knew that, but it was real. I knew that too somehow. Harriet was born on a moonless night in October. The delivery room lights flickered and died just as she crowned, and when she finally emerged, she didn't cry. She just stared at me with eyes that seemed too knowing for a newborn. The nurses said it was normal, that some babies are just quiet. They ran some tests, signed the birth certificate, swaddled her and gave her back to me. I went home a day later, alone and relieved. It was short-lived. As she grew, it became clear something wasn't right. Harriet never babbled like other babies. She didn't laugh or cry, just watched. Always watching. By age 2, she was diagnosed with solar urticaria, an extreme sensitivity to sunlight that kept her indoors during the day. Her skin would blister and burn within seconds of sun exposure, so we became creatures of the night, venturing out only after sunset. The doctors ran test after test, checking for autism, selective mutism, any explanation for her complete lack of verbal communication. Everything came back normal, but I began to wonder. Small, paranoid thoughts began to fester in my mind. I saw the way animals reacted to her, the way neighborhood dogs would whimper and hide when we passed, the way birds would fall silent and still when she looked at them. At night, I'd often find her standing at her bedroom window, small hands pressed against the glass, staring out at our moonlit street as if waiting for something, or someone. Sometimes I swore I could hear her whispering, though she'd been nonverbal her entire life. I made a good show of being stern at first, demanding she go to bed. She'd go willingly enough. Oh, she always obedient. But after the 7th or 8th time I caught her standing there, rigid and whispering, I stopped chiding her. Stopped searching for her in the night at all. Truth be told, she scared the shit out of me. I'd simply stand in the doorway, watching her silently, rehearsed admonishments curdling in my mouth. One time, as if she'd somehow heard my footsteps, she looked back over her shoulder at me. We simply looked at each other for nearly 15 silent minutes. I swear to God, when I turned to walk away, I think she smirked. She turned 5 on a Monday. The brides of Christendom came on the following Tuesday. Two women in flowing white robes stood on my doorstep, pamphlets in hand. Their skin was pale, their hair so black it seemed to absorb light. Familiar coloring. I saw similar features whenever I stared in the mirror each morning. I remember staring down at that pamphlet, debating with myself. But I'd been living with a strange little child for 5 harrowing years by that point, and I'd recently finished reading all of my mother's journals. I'd read Sylvia's warning. So I mentioned my grandmother had been part of their community once, and their eyes lit up with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Sylvia's granddaughter, one of them breathed, reaching out to touch my hand. We've been looking for you for so long. I shouldn't have invited them in. But I was desperate for answers about my family history, about Sylvia. They sat primly on my couch, their white robes pooling around them like spilled milk. We talked about mundane things at first, the weather, the neighborhood, their charitable work. They were articulate and warm, speaking passionately about their women's shelters and educational programs. Something about their careful politeness reminded me of funeral directors. Then Harriet wandered into the room. The change was subtle but immediate. One of them stopped mid-sentence, her carefully practiced smile faltering for just a moment. They exchanged a glance that lasted a fraction too long. The younger one leaned forward slightly, hands clasped in her lap so tightly her knuckles bled white. "What a beautiful child," the older one said. "Is she yours?" "Yes." "Biological? Why does that matter?" They began asking questions then, each one seemingly innocent but somehow wrong. Had she always been so quiet? Did she have many friends her age? Was she eating well? Did she sleep through the night? When was her last checkup? When I tried to steer the conversation back to Sylvia, they barely seemed to hear me. Their attention remained fixed on Harriet, who stood silently in the doorway, watching them with her unnaturally still gaze. "We have a wonderful children's program," the younger one said, reaching into her bag. "Many special little girls like Harriet have found their true purpose with us. Their true family." Something about the way she said purpose made my skin crawl. I asked them to leave. That night, I heard voices from Harriet's room. Not children's voices, something else. Something that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. When I burst in, she was alone, but her walls, they were covered in drawings. I've worked in pharmaceutical research. I've seen medical textbooks with detailed surgical procedures. Nothing prepared me for what my 4-year-old had drawn. Women split open from throat to pelvis, their organs replaced with writhing shapes that might have been tentacles or might have been something worse. Faces caught in moments of transformation, skin peeling back to reveal something underneath that didn't follow the rules of anatomy. Not a simple child's doodling, I'm telling you. The drawings grew more detailed every night. More disturbing. She drew them with anything she could find, crayons, markers, her own blood when I took away her art supplies. I'd washed the walls clean before bed only to find them covered again by morning, the images more elaborate, more horrifying. Naked women being penetrated by shadows that seemed to move on the paper. I have no idea how she even knows what sex is. She doesn't watch television, shows little interest in books, doesn't speak with and therefore cannot be influenced by neighborhood kids. I'm not even sure if you could call what she drew sex, to be frank. It came across as more violent. Ritualistic. The changes in Harriet accelerated after that. Her skin began to slough off in patches, revealing something dark and iridescent underneath. Her eyes gradually darkened until they were completely black, and her fingernails turned the color of tar. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of infection, but deep down, I knew better. At the start I took her to see doctors and specialists, but nothing worked. When they started mentioning prolonged hospitalization and tests, Harriet would act out, violently, both towards me and herself. But at this point, despite spending a lifetime grounded in the exploration of the real, for priding myself in being an individual of sound logic, I knew this was something else. Nothing that medicine could explain. Something other. She stopped sleeping. I'd find her standing in different rooms at night, perfectly still, her head tilted at an angle that made my neck hurt just to look at. Sometimes she tracked movement I couldn't see, her black eyes following invisible things across the ceiling. The houseplants started dying, then the grass in our yard, spreading outward from her bedroom window in a perfect circle. I found her in the neighbor's yard one night, crouched over their German shepherd. The dog's chest was torn open, and Harriet's face was buried in the cavity. When she looked up at me, blood dripping from her chin, she spoke for the first time. The sound she made wasn't English, wasn't anything human. It reminded me of the sound oil makes when it hits a hot pan, all sizzle and hiss, but underneath was something else, something that made me taste metal and smell burning hair. I ran inside and vomited until there was nothing left but bile. Forgive me, but I was a mother, and I loved her despite it all. I buried the dog before the sun rose. Feigned ignorance when the neighbors came knocking. I found the dog's collar days later, hidden beneath Harriet's pillow like some kind of trophy. She should have been locked up in a psychiatric ward that day. But I was weak, and besides, it wouldn't have worked. Desperate, I began researching the New Eden community. I found an online forum for survivors and connected with a user called ThirtBello82. She seemed to know things, horrible things, about the community's true purpose. About the 7 compounds spread across North America, Germany, and Australia. About the rooms deep underground where they took the girls who were ready. Her messages became increasingly frantic as we talked. She told me about her time in the compound, about the screams that echoed up from below, about the girls who went down with flat stomachs and came up 9 months later with something moving under their skin. She would have gone herself if she hadn't developed a cancer young that rendered her likely infertile. Thank fuck for osteosarcoma, she joked. Then she asked about Harriet's symptoms, and each answer I gave made her more agitated. You need to end it, she wrote finally. Before they complete the circle. Before all 7 are born. I can't find her account anymore. I hope nothing has happened to her. But that brings us to tonight. Tonight, I woke to a smell like rotting meat. Following it led me to Harriet's room, where I found a pile of what looked like shed snake skin, but I recognized the birthmark on one piece. The blood trail led to our bathroom, where I found her. Jesus, I can barely write it. I can't describe what my daughter had become. What sat in our bathtub looked almost right, but wrong in ways my mind couldn't properly process. Like when you see a face in a dream and know it's your mother, but wake up remembering features that couldn't possibly fit together into a human face. Parts of her seemed to fade in and out of my vision, as if whatever she was becoming couldn't fully exist in our reality. When she moved, her joints bent in directions that made my eyes hurt. Her skin rippled like oil on water, and underneath. God, underneath was something that made me understand why Sylvia went mad. I did what my grandmother had tried to do. What she knew needed to be done. The thing that had been my daughter thrashed and fought, but in the end, I held it under the water. I kept whispering, I'm sorry, even as its claws tore into my arms. Even as I watched my baby girl's face shift between human and monster under the thrashing water. The hardest part wasn't the physical struggle. It was when she stopped fighting. When her face became human again and she looked up at me through the water with those big brown eyes, my eyes, and reached for me like she used to when she was small. Like she wanted her mama to hold her. But I'd seen what was inside her now. I knew what was coming. I held on until the bubbles stopped. And then I ran. I don't know what I'm doing. I want to die. I should die. I shouldn't be in the first place. I'm standing under a bridge somewhere downtown. Did I mention that? I'm wet and I just killed my daughter. Only she wasn't, or she is, but she's also something else as well. To anyone reading this, if you've escaped from the brides of Christendom, if you carry their bloodline, please, don't have children. Don't let them complete their circles of 7. Something is coming, something ancient and hungry, and it's using our daughters as doorways. I know what the scene in my bathroom looks like. I know what they'll think I've done. But please, someone has to investigate the compounds. Look for the dark rooms. Count the pregnant girls. Maybe then you'll understand why I had to.